All right, let's see. Good morning. Did that pop up for you nicely, the share there?
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yep, that looks good. Thanks.
All right, and because this is a meeting, I'm going to keep you guys up on my other screen because I love to see if anybody reacts or waves. I'll try to engage. Um, Marcia and Jill and everyone, it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here, and it's always really nice to hear that somebody was, interested after having seen another version of the talk. So I hope to live up to it today and really an honor to call in. I told um, Marcia that my little cousin lives in the UP right now, going to Michigan Tech, and saw the poster for your for this symposium and texted me a picture. It was like, "Aren't you in New York? Are you coming next week?" So I was
Uh,
like, "I'm still in New York," but I was just so thrilled to be connected to you guys and um, wish I could be there in person. And I think there is some feedback I'm getting from if everybody just make sure you mute. So I'm gonna jump right in and try to talk for about 40 minutes, right, to leave enough time to chat before handing off to the next speaker. So as you heard, I think the title of this talk may have evolved since it was last posted, but it's the same exact idea, which is forest-associated pollinators. What the heck is that? What do we mean? And that's why I put in the subtitle the word surprising, because I think we don't always think about bees in our woods, and I think it's really fun to expand our imagination to include the woods as another amazing place that pollinators are. And so I say surprising ways that bees use the woods and how you can support them. Um, and really an honor to be here. So to get started, thank you so much for the really kind introduction to the Xerces Society. We are a nonprofit organization named for the Xerces blue butterfly, and the Xerces blue went extinct earlier in this, well, last century. And in 1971, some really prescient and amazing entomologists and community activists were like, we want to not make that happen again. And so named the Xerces Society after the now extinct Xerces blue. And I just learned because Robert Pyle, who's one of our founders, got to meet with one of my colleagues that they were also inspired by the X kind of reminding the word extinction, which I hadn't actually heard that part of the origin story until they had dinner a couple months ago. And so we work on a lot of different programs. I'm part of the pollinator team, which works in pollinator conservation and has largely been working in agricultural systems. We have an incredible pesticide team, endangered species program, community science. We have an incredible ambassador program. And I do always have to and want to thank so much all of our myriad supporters who are always crucial to our work. And then to highlight particularly that a very large proportion of our funding does come from our members. And in this period of precarity, if you are inspired to join, we rely on our members more than ever and potentially increasingly over the coming months and years. So we really are grateful to those of you who may be members or may feel inspired to join us. So yeah, and thank you to any of you who are. All right, so why do we do what we do? I can't take credit for designing this incredibly beautiful slide. My colleague Lisa did this, and it stuns me every time I open it. We're motivated not just by kind of the endless enthusiasm that invertebrates can inspire if you're already part of kind of realizing how magical they are, but also for all the ways that they run our world. So we like to say they are the life that sustains us. And so we highlight here just 6 of the many ways that invertebrates keep our world healthy and functioning, from food for wildlife as part of the food chain. Some people are never going to like a bug, but they may like birds. In really crucial biological pest control work, whether that's predators or parasitoids, working in both natural and managed systems. Pollination services is, of course, what I have done all of my graduate work on, and I'm also on the pollinator team. So I'm going to be spending most of my time thinking today about the most effective and kind of charismatic pollinators, which are the bees, but they are, of course, part of a very wide suite of many, many different organisms that do incredible and important pollination work. Plant seed dispersal is another one that I'll mention maybe briefly as especially cool in forests when we think about spring ephemerals and plant seed dispersal. We have an incredible team that's newer that works on water filtration, and they think about mussels a lot and how important they don't have backbones, right? So even though they're not insects, they are invertebrates doing really incredible water quality work and also threatened, and then soil health, decomposition. And I have a colleague I can direct you to if you ever want to learn everything there possibly is to know about dung beetles. So, unfortunately, many of our invertebrates are facing really steep declines. We don't have good data on all invertebrates. The numbers are enormous, and we don't have records on exactly how many of them there all used to be. But we do know that there are really staggering declines in overall abundance and diversity in many long-term studies. And charismatic taxa, who have been well monitored over the years, are showing precipitous declines, which of course vary by region. And there's a lot of complexity and nuance to exactly which species are changing and how they're responding. But we know with that these incredibly important ecosystem services are in need of help. And there's not one smoking gun or one particular driver. Instead, it's kind of a really difficult soup that this really powerful paper called Death by 1,000 Cuts, Global Threats to Insects. And, these kind of many different stressors are going to be familiar, I'm sure, to anyone on this call doing the incredible work that Wild Ones and associated groups are doing. But they are, boiled down broadly into things like habitat loss. And I'm going to be broadly talking about habitat today. Poor land management, invasive species, excessive browse pressure, resource competition, pesticides, disease, and then the complex and sometimes counterintuitive and unpredictable ways that climate change can synergize or interact with all of those. I think that this can be really overwhelming, but another way that I like to think about it too is that maybe there's one piece of this that is a piece that you can particularly engage with or that makes the most sense in your region. And we can't do all of it alone, but we can each focus on the part of it that is the closest to our expertise or our homes. And maybe that can be a reframe rather than feeling overwhelmed. So that was just the background. I'm going to jump into an introduction to what is a bee, what's going on, why did we even look in the woods at all to try to figure out why there were bees in the woods, why would we do that, then kind of define what I think of as a forest-associated bee, trace some natural history stories, and I like to organize this just so you can anticipate it from the forest floor up to the canopy, so we'll do it in a vertically stratified way. And try to tie it all together, hopefully throughout, with kind of implications for ways we can think about looking at a forest and wondering if there's ways we could support it to be even more supportive of our pollinators. So I think this is something that many of us think we know, and maybe this group already does, but I like to kind of be like, wait a minute, do we know what a bee is? And my favorite way to define a bee is to say that they're the fuzzy vegetarian cousins of wasps. What? So about 120 million years ago, the common ancestor of what are today's bees and wasps, in quotes, right? We don't want to personify them too much, but they figured out that there was just as much or a sufficient amount of protein and lipids and other micronutrients in the pollen and nectar that flowers made to raise their babies. And so they kind of switched over from just being carnivores, like, this wasp on the left who's bringing a caterpillar home to feed to a baby larvae. And then instead there was this whole group of insects who are now the descendants of that ancestor who figured out that pollen had a lot of protein and other macronutrients in it, who then use plants. And when I say plants, I mean the pollen and the nectar produced by plants. So that's why we say they're vegetarians, because they're going to our flowers and they don't care at all if they're helping the plant make a seed or a fruit. They're not there to say, I want to turn your apple flower into an apple. They're not being altruistic, although I think that's lovely. But instead they're saying, how can I get as much protein and lipids and food that I can bring home to my nest and feed my baby? And because they're messy, and because they go from flower to flower, and because they're very diligent about their work of collecting as much pollen as they can, they do go from flower to flower. And that means that they can drop, or do drop, even though they don't even want to, they drop pollen on other flowers, and that's how the pollination happens. And so when I say, I don't just say fuzzy to be whimsical, but I like to say they're fuzzy vegetarians because they actually, over this evolutionary time, developed really specific branched hairs on their bodies that are perfect for carrying home the pollen that they need to carry home in order to get enough of it to feed a baby, right? You don't need special shaped little tiny hairs on your legs in order to carry home a caterpillar. You need different skills for that. But if you're going to pack tons and tons and tons of sticky little pollen into your legs or into your underbelly or onto the back of your thorax, depending on which bee you are, you need special branched hairs to help you hold on to them. So they're fuzzy vegetarian wasp cousins. And over those last 120 million years, there are so many different kinds of flowers and so many different parts of the world that actually this led to an enormous diversification of bee species. So even though honeybees usually come to mind as our most familiar and charismatic bee, we actually have over 20,000 different species of bees. And that should say Michigan. It's 465 in Michigan. I really apologize. That is the correct number for Michigan. I just didn't change the word. I'm really sorry. And these bees come in all different shapes and sizes. So you guys in Michigan, I think this is the Mitten and the UP, are there over 460 species together in Michigan. And you can see just from these pictures, which of course are what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different species, the enormous range in shapes and sizes. And also imagine for a second that you're the size of that bee. And imagine if you're that small, how different those flowers must look to you at that scale, right? Imagine how big that huge yellow aster is, or if you're trying to go in a leguminous flower and you have to figure out how to climb up over into that kind of symmetrical pea-shaped flower, totally different interaction. And so these bees end up with lots and lots of different shapes, strategies, and preferences for which taxa they're most specialized on, or prefer to use, or choose to use, even if they're not restricted. And so now that we know that there's this many bees out there, it's actually now helpful to zoom back in and say, hang on, so do they not all live like honeybees, right? And the answer is, spoiler alert, over 90% of them, the adults actually live alone. And so the social bees, these super, super social bees that we all learn about first in kindergarten that are really, really cool, that have these amazing complex social structures, they're actually only 5% of our total number. And the vast majority, each female lives alone and has a very short adult flight period. And the vast majority of their life will be in the nest, developing from egg to pupae. And then they only emerge as an adult for a couple weeks before they'll mate. They'll make as many babies as they can for next year and then die. So an example of this, imagine you're a soil nesting solitary bee. You're very gentle. You're not defending a social colony underground. So you're not going to attack anybody whose lawnmower runs over you. You're not going to attack any kid whose ball runs over your nest. You're just a little gentle baby bee. It's only the social ones who will chase you. And so you're maybe underground all winter long as your little pupae. You feel the temperature and moisture cues change. You realize it's springtime. So the males come up, and then a couple weeks later, the females come up. You may have cellophane bees doing this out in familiar places near you soon. They're the most obvious ones usually. And then you have a couple weeks where we see those bees going back and forth from their nests to the flowers, back to the nest to the flowers. And what they're doing down in their nest, in this example, it's a soil nesting bee. They're dropping off the pollen in little chambers deep below ground where they drop pollen one trip at a time. It might take tens of trips to make us enough pollen for a single baby bee. Lay an egg on that pollen ball, close up the little chamber, and then make as many as you can until it's time to die. And so then those eggs develop underground until next year. And this is just an example of a spring bee, right? And so if you bear with this little schematic here, that first bee I showed you was active in April, but then there's all these other bees who are active throughout the season. And so even though we're like, yeah, I see bees all year, great, those are the bees, they're actually a changing, turning over community that shifts as the seasons shift. And when you learn to see them, that's actually really, really magical. Okay, so that's the solitary bee life cycle. Because we all know and love bumblebees, I do just want to quickly introduce bumblebees. This is the only other one I'm going to make you learn. So don't worry, we're not going to do like 18 in a row. Bear with me. So here's bumblebee life cycle. Queens overwinter alone, right? Honeybees, a whole group of them all overwinter together, eating that honey that they stored up all season, right? Bumblebees, everybody else in the colony dies except the queen. She mates in the fall, and then she goes and hides in the forest floor or somewhere else protected. We'll talk about that later. And then only that queen overwinters. And then in the spring, she has to start the colony over, brand new, starts laying her eggs. If she lays a fertilized egg, she makes her little workers. And then as that colony grows, eventually they decide it's time to make next year's queens and the males with unfertilized eggs. And then they all mate, and then the queen overwinters again. So basically, all you need to know is bumblebees social during the summer, solitary in the winter. And those social bees are out for the full season. And so if we take our schematic and then we imagine, okay, there are some taxa that are out throughout the whole season, and they especially need to be able to switch flowers as the flowers change across the year, right? Okay, so this is an oversimplification, but kind of the general principle of the major types of life cycles going on. You can get as complicated as you want. But so we have all these different diversity of bees, right? Imagine just in Michigan alone, over 450 species. And many of them, because of those highly specialized relationships with their flowers, may actually be more effective on a per visit basis than honeybees at pollinating a given flower. And I'm happy to answer or talk more about those dynamics, but it's not the function of the talk, so I'm going to keep moving. But generally, we do know that that's really important for crop pollination services, especially as folks increasingly worry about threats to honeybees. They're also incredibly important for many of our wild plants, including rare and declining wildflowers and other precious plants that maybe honeybees aren't well adapted to use or don't choose to use. And we do know that more species are needed across larger spaces and time, right? Imagine you're a flower with a really widespread distribution. You may be relying on one group of bees, over here in New York, and maybe that same flower's range extends into Michigan, but maybe there's different bees who are actually its best pollinators. So the bigger the range of time and space and weather variability and different pressures or landscapes we're thinking about, we need that real strong diversity of insects to ensure that every population of plants has sufficient kind of insurance policy or redundancy to maintain those pollination services. And we do know from research studies that diversity loss reduces plant reproductive success, and that much of this diversity loss, as I kind of mentioned already, is threatened by things like habitat loss, habitat quality degradation, right? Just because there's plants there, are they helpful plants? And groups like Wild Ones, are incredible allies in doing this kind of communication and work in our communities. And then, of course, pesticides. I already said this. These other stressors that all interact. And so one reason that we're going to kind of be like, whoa, why are we looking in the woods, right? Is and so I like to contextualize this with how recent a lot of this work is. Bird people have been looking at all different habitat associations for all their different birds for decades and decades, at least from a bee person's perspective. We actually are really catching up to a lot of the level of complexity of habitat associations because and you all probably remember this, in 2006, 2007, all the headlines were just like colony collapse disorder, all the honeybees are dying. And suddenly there was just this huge influx of federal funding, concern, public imagination was captured to be like, wow, we really need to know more about our wild pollinators, because nobody had really been asking, are the honeybees the ones doing the bulk of the work? We all liked honey. A lot of people like being beekeepers. The industry was out there. It was just happening. We weren't worrying about it. And so there were like a bunch of entomology nerds who were, some of my advisors and their predecessors who were studying the wild bees, but it didn't have an urgent kind of cultural, economic engine behind it until about 15, 20 years ago. And so I'm part of this generation of people who was in high school when this news started hitting and became part of a generation of people being like, wow, we actually don't know very much at all about the life cycles of these bees. And that's true across the board for invertebrates. There is so much that we do not know about their life cycles, preferences, forage, habitat. So young people in your life, tell them we still need to know, although grad school is not well funded this year. So sorry. Okay, no more annotated comments. So it's quite a moment. So as we started worrying about honeybees as a, broadly, research started looking and with also that's why I say this, all this research really started in ag systems. And so was like, oh my God, if we have really bad colony collapse disorder, what are we going to do? And so then there were some really powerful studies that were like, the wild bees actually are doing a ton of the pollination services in our agricultural systems, even when there's honeybees there. Wow. And so then we started looking and saying, okay, like what do those guys need? How do we help them? And that research was finding that these wild bees and their diversity in agricultural systems was broadly and highly correlated with natural habitat, abundance and diversity, reduced pesticide exposure or effects of pesticide exposure, lower pathogen loads were found in wild bees in agricultural systems with more natural habitat nearby. And this even translated to higher pollination success for those focal crops, translating even to higher crop yields, which actually could lead to marketability change. So here's an example, forests and hedgerows particularly linked to crop pollination success, right? This landscape scale in apple orchards, they were even finding that in a single apple orchard, even as you got closer down the row to the nearby forest woodlot, you were finding more bees. And it is really hard to find patterns like that in ecology. Insects are flying all over the place. It's amazing to find a relationship that strong. And so here's just, an example of a graph showing like increasing natural habitat around a bunch of different fields. And in those fields, the ones that had higher natural habitat nearby, which was largely forest, had more bees and more numbers of bees. So, and people were finding that even in a really simplified landscape, a small forest patch in the middle of that landscape could do a lot of habitat work. And this was particularly important in a big recent synthesis that came out 2 years ago, that over 10 different countries, when you look in their spring crops particularly, I'll talk more about this season thing in a minute, the spring crops particularly were showing this really strong relationship with forest habitat, less so than summer crops. And so you're all still with me? I know I'm throwing a lot at you real fast. Okay. So usually when we think about pollinator habitat, right, and we're correct, we end up thinking about things like meadows and our front gardens, right? And we think especially, and I do this all the time, when we recommend open habitat things like a meadow or like a front garden, we say, starting in spring, maybe that's May, maybe that's June, all the way through till fall when your asters die down, we want continuous flowers and continuous bloom. Still true, right? But I like to say kind of, if we think about that turnover, this is just the same idea as that figure I showed you before, right? With those different peaks being different species of bees across the season, those classic pollinator meadows are really covering that later half of the year because we're going to talk about shortly, bees are going to start coming out any minute now. I know you guys have more snow than I do, but there's already bees out where I am, right? And it's only April. So, and so one really interesting, and I know this is a little bit data heavy, but this is really powerful research that was done in Michigan. So I really wanted to highlight it. Rufus Isaac's lab is a powerhouse in Michigan, and they do really thoughtful, careful work. And they were looking at, in this case, two crops, blueberry and tart cherry. And cherry, of course, especially is an early season bloomer. And they were looking at the adjacent wildflower strips that they were putting in to help their pollinators. And they looked at both just like an unenhanced, like they didn't add any flowers, just kind of like a weedy edge or a mowed edge. And then they put in all these wildflower strips. And what these circles are just showing you, don't worry about it too much, but if they're not overlapping, that means that the communities of bees and the pollen being used by those bees, both results were found in this paper, did not overlap. And so if we look at the circle of all the little bees that were on tart cherry, they were really, really different than the ones who were actually in that herbaceous control. So if you're a bumblebee, that might be fine. You visit the cherry, and then a couple weeks later, you go over and you visit the wildflowers. Good. Still doing really good habitat work. But if you're trying to say, who are the bees that are going to be the ones visiting the cherry in the early spring, when they zoomed in and looked at those pollen resources being used by the bees active in those spring periods, it was all woody plants. It was willow, it was maple, it was cherry, it was sumac, it was rubus. And similar work in upstate New York, looking at apple orchards and all of the pollens and the resources being used by those early spring apple orchard pollinators. Again, cherry, maple, willow, even wind pollinated species like ash and beech, which was totally astonishing, but the bees don't care. They're not trying to pollinate. They just want protein. And hawthorn and some other early spring trees. So this was some of our first kind of data, like, oh my God, like maybe this is what they're using before, and then later they move into those habitats, right? And so a way to visualize that, right, is just in a broad oversimplification, right? But this is a big picture rule of thumb. The woody resources are providing the bulk of the early spring resources, and then we move into more open habitats. You imagine your old field meadows, your garden, your open crop fields. Those are providing more resources later in the season. And so this is just a yes and, right? We need both in order to support everybody. And we need both to be healthy and diverse and full of native species. And I don't need to tell anyone in the UP this, right? We live in forested landscapes. And so it's not that surprising. I just like to kind of think through that if you've been around as a little bee evolving for 120 million years and you're living in, northern Michigan, or you're living in upstate New York, it's totally reasonable that some subset of any group of insects is going to have some relationship with forested habitats to some degree. This is just the landscape that they live in. And so we're going to have some give and take with different groups using different types of habitat. And of course, forests do, in a lot of ways, give a lot of these things that we know that invertebrates need: food, shelter, and protection, right? And this is a general slide that I like to use that just kind of reminds us of, invertebrates need basically the same kinds of things we need, right? Food, somewhere to sleep at night, and to not have their homes destroyed and to not be sprayed by poisons, among other things. And so why haven't we been looking at the forests? And I've really already said this, but I'm going to give you one more layer of kind of ecology here, which is just, right, I already said way less pollinator research before the honeybee concern. And so we just hadn't looked. But also, as many of us know, in deciduous forests especially, understory is really dark after leaf out, right? But is only lighter in spring before the leaves all come out, but there's still sun hitting the forest floor. But a lot of research was happening in the summer, because that's when researchers aren't teaching classes or taking classes. And that's the classic bee time in our brains. And so we were just doing summer field work, and forests are pretty dark and don't have a lot of obvious activity in midsummer. Canopies are really hard to reach. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the canopy, and it's real hard to get up there and see what's going on. So that's a reason. And even though I have told you, right, like, oh, they don't care if they're pollinating or not, still, we would evolutionarily expect wind pollinated trees to offer less good resources, and many of our trees are wind pollinated. And so we had kind of just assumed they weren't using them to a degree. Okay, so wow, we only made it through the first part. Don't worry, we'll get through everything. But so this leads us to kind of like, now we've talked about time, we've talked about why we started looking, we've talked about how it matters for helping a community, even if you're, an apple orchard grower, you want to think about the woods, etc. But can we kind of get a classification of who it is if we're thinking about bees in the woods? Are they a special group of bees? And so, to kind of introduce this, if you're a person who thinks about birds a lot and you think about, your golden wing warbler needs early successional habitat, your cerulean warbler needs mature forest habitat, or if you want to come over to invertebrates, the eastern ironclad beetle is really strongly associated with really, really mature, one might say, a forest with old growth characteristics, whereas the Karner blue butterfly is kind of another invertebrate who is famously associated with regular disturbance and fire and forests with open areas, right? And so it's not unusual when we remember our broader context of organisms to think that there are different groups that have different associations with different forest types or different age groups, right? And similarly, one of the only studies that's really done this super, super thoroughly for bees took all of these bees. And so this was work done across New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, And they looked at which bees were really, really, really only found in highly forested landscapes with very, very little open habitat. And they found a strong positive relationship with increasing forest cover in the landscape led to an increase of this group of bees. And this was actually a subset of the northeastern taxa, which do have a lot of overlap with Michigan taxa. And 32% of them were forest associated. Another 37% seemed to use landscapes that had both forest and open habitat. And then this like 37% were broadly associated with more open agricultural and anthropogenic landscapes. And so again, remembering over, in this region, we have over 700 species total across that whole area. Many of them are similar to those 400 that you have. And so we have these different kind of really broad buckets of associations within which then we can learn a lot more details. And so, yeah, that's pretty amazing. And I wanted to show you this because I've gestured at the seasonality of it a lot. And so this graph on the left here is just total number of bees. The graph on the right is number of kinds of bees. Just pick one and look at it. They basically say the same thing. If you are looking across time, right? If we go from left to right, we're looking across time from May to October. And we see that this green line is really high in the spring. This study only started in May. And they saw a really, really high bee abundance and number of bees in the forest, that's the green line, in early spring, and then it dropped off as the season came later. And then they started seeing that all the bees were in these yellow and orange places, and those were agricultural and urbanized landscapes, right? And so I love giving this talk this time of year because you're about to get to see them all. When I give this talk in July, it's kind of like, okay, now live through the whole winter and then start looking for your bees, right? But no, we're about to be able to go out and start finding so many of these friends. And so when we think about these forest-associated bees, the bulk of the activity is going to be in the early spring. And we know that when forest drops below about 30% in the landscape, we start to really lose these bees. That doesn't mean we want to go all the way down to 30 and keep them precarious, but it means that that's when we really start to see that population really start to fall apart. So in highly fragmented landscapes, like where I was working in the mid-Atlantic or southern New York, closer to New York City, we really start worrying about being in a historically forested landscape that's highly, highly fragmented, and that we're really going to start losing that subset of bees. And just one more way to think about this, because I think visualizing it different ways helps different brains. And I really like this figure. This one was just done for bumblebees by some really fantastic bumblebee experts out in Colorado. And they asked the question a little differently, but came to the same conclusion of roughly 1/3 of bumblebees really, really associated with fully forested landscapes. Another third of bumblebees representing this common eastern bumblebee, who I see everywhere, really can handle living across the gradient of habitat. And then we have other bees, for example, Bombus fervidus, a really charismatic, beautiful bee, but doesn't rely on forest as much, right? And so we just have these different habitat associations within our broad community. All right, so now we get to tell fun stories about what they're doing in the woods. And I'm running a little bit long. I'll definitely be done before 10, but I'm going to maybe only have 8 or 10 minutes for questions instead of 20. Is that okay? Okay, thanks, Jill. Sweet. I'm going to take a sip of coffee here. So, I clearly need coffee, right? So, one thing that's really fun, right, is especially if we're used to walking around in deciduous forests in the summer, we're like, well, what's going on in this like super dark place? So I really like my colleague Mike made this figure and he's like, makes it look all dark in there. Like, what's going on? Because we know already that young forests, right? And especially, I know, there's a lot of timber industry in northern Michigan. There's a lot of places where you get these gaps in the forest. Maybe you have a meadow and a forested matrix. That's where our brains see our bees, right? And one thing that I like to remind us, especially if we're working in those kinds of landscapes, is that that is really good pollinator habitat. And the reason why it looks like almost so extremely magical is because depending on how nearby other open habitat is, you might be getting all those forest-associated bees flying out of the woods into a gap and saying, oh, cool, look at all these new flowers over here. Sure, if they're blooming while I'm out, some of them can switch and use those flowers. And if you're near enough to other open habitat, all the open habitat bees fly in also. And so gaps in the woods can look like just the biggest peak of all the bees ever because you're getting the whole community. But that doesn't mean that the forest doesn't matter. It just means that the forest is the forest associated bees, and then you get to see the whole party when you have a gap in the woods. Okay, so this figure, I'm going to step through one thing at a time. So I hope it feels like kind of an outline and helpful rather than overwhelming. We're going to do just like a couple of these stories to say, imagine we're in a forest that has, right, here's a deciduous tree, here's a coniferous tree, here's a shrub, here's a little schematic of some understory flowers, here's some dead wood and some soil layers. And we're going to think about bees that use different parts of this schematic. So I'm going to start with this yellow one here, the understory specialists. And this one is my absolute favorite part of everything in the world. I was going to try and qualify that more and couldn't. So remember for a moment that these are solitary bees that live for maybe 4 weeks, right? So if you're out for just a couple of weeks and you're a tiny little bee for whom a flower is huge, you might say, oh my gosh, every time I ever fly, that trout lily is out. Why am I bothering trying to visit the bellflower? Why am I trying to go to Dutchman's Breeches? Why am I trying to go over and see if I can use that stupid trillium? I'm just going to get really, really, really good at collecting pollen from trout lily. And my babies are going to get really, really, really good at digesting trout lily pollen. And I'm going to get really good at seeing it, finding it, recognizing its chemical signal in the air. And that way I can just be super efficient. I can nest near trout lily flowers so that I come up into a bed of food and I can, right? And so then they can, this specialization allows for efficiency. If other insects haven't learned how to use trout lily, or like this other one on my screen, if they've specialized on Geranium maculatum, they're not competing anymore either, right? And so then there's this just incredible release from competition. And another thing also is that it can mean that there's incredible vulnerability. If there's a legacy of tillage, that means that those plants can't grow anymore. If it turns out your deer's favorite food, I'm living in a region with extremely anomalously high deer populations relative to historical levels. And so we are, losing these to excessive deer browse, a native species, but out of balance, right? And so it both can mean that they have this magical escape from competition in a healthy ecosystem and a really good food resource, or it can mean that they have high vulnerability if a pressure targets their host plant. And then the picture in the middle here is actually not the trout lily specialist, but just a reminder that there are bees who are less specialized who also use lots and lots of our understory resources and together make the complexity of that community. I'm going to show you one more. This is Andrena erigene. Who is the spring beauty mining bee. And that's the one on the left here. This is a different bee on the right, but this is the spring beauty mining bee here on the left. And you can kind of see that the pollen on the back of her legs is pinkish. And so it can be hard to identify these bees if you're out in the woods, but they have little white lines right inside their eyes if they're in the genus for the mining bees. And the spring beauty mining bee is one of the only ones who's going to have legs just packed full of this pinkish pollen because she only uses spring beauty pollen and it's pink. And so I love this old paper. I know I've just switched to black and white from those huge, gorgeous pictures by Heather Holm, but this is a really fun paper from 1975 that showed a nesting aggregation. On the left here, they found all of these little solitary bee entrance holes in this well-lit forest floor before the trees all leafed out, where all of these spring beauty mining bees were nesting on the forest floor. And then the next panel in that far left picture there, where there's two pictures side by side, it then got dark and the researchers couldn't even find the nest entrances anymore, right? Those bees only flew for a couple weeks. Leaves came out, got dark, couldn't even the researchers who were experts in this bee couldn't find the nests anymore. But they were there underneath. And then they have this picture of what the little underground tunnels looked like and a kind of a vertical cross section of all the little chambers that the baby bees were provisioned with a ball of spring beauty pollen. And then I love that they got this really cute picture of the bee's face peeking up from the ground. And again, these are super, super gentle. They have no motivation to sting. It's just one little female. If she comes out and starts stinging every mammal who flies by, Nobody's going to feed her babies. You only do that if you're a big social colony with a guard group of bees, right? So these guys are super, super gentle. Okay, I'm gonna stop there with that topic for now, just because we could talk about it all day and we have other things to talk about. But get ready for your spring ephemerals, and I can share a list at the end today of all of the known ephemeral and specialist pairings, because there's a whole list of them. Okay, so next we're gonna go up to deadwood nesting, and my absolute extreme charismatic, this one you actually can see all through the year, the shiny green sweat bee. And my colleague Julie likes to say boring beetles, although she loves beetles, so it's silly because she doesn't think beetles are boring at all. But boring beetles lead to interesting bees. The idea being the beetles bore into the wood and leave behind an access where something like a bee can later use the hole that that beetle made in the log and use it as a wood nesting as a place to nest in the wood. So if you have a big log like this, or if you even have it as kind of a stump in your, for a table in your backyard, if it's not treated and it's kind of still strong enough to have structural integrity, but maybe has some kind of decomposing crumbly parts inside, that's ideal for the shiny green sweat bee to go fly inside and make little chambers. And just like I showed you with those pollen balls, being provisioned in chambers underground, they will similarly be digging out tunnels and making little chambers in the soft enough wood and making little balls of pollen and flying in and out and in and out. These guys also super, super gentle. If you have them in your backyard, think of them as just like little flying jewels. They will also visit your flowers. I guarantee you have shiny green sweat bee visiting flowers in your garden, and maybe you just thought of it was a fly. But once you learn to recognize it as the shiny green sweat bee, it's super, super charismatic. While we're talking about nesting in deadwood, because there's nothing entomologists love more than deadwood, snags, stumps, piles of logs, there's always a ton going on. I've seen these in the early spring where like you think you haven't seen anything, you're out looking for a patch of spring ephemerals, just like stare at some kind of dry snags and stumps for a little while and you might get lucky and see something flying in and out. And you're like, oh, they are here. Huh. I thought there was nothing happening yet. And so I wanted to show you this one. This was in South Jersey. This is conifer forest. This is the Pine Barrens, a fire-driven, pitch pine dominated ecosystem. But I was walking along a stream. I got distracted by a Carolina wren and went, huh, I wonder what's happening in this snag. It just gives me bee vibes. And I needed a drink of water and I was a nice day. So I just stood there and stared at this stump for a little snag for a little while. And eventually I did find, oh, wait, I don't know if you can see it right in the middle here. So see where my mouse, can you see my mouse? So that part of where my mouse is where the bee's going to come out. And it's like, it's loading, getting ready to play. And then ooh, flies out. Okay, so I know that's frustrating, but I kind of show it because that's also how frustrating it is in real life. Like, they're so hard to see, and the second you see them, they're gone. But that one was a mason bee, and I watched it for another 15, 20 minutes, and there were a whole bunch all coming into different holes, each running a different solitary nest. And my guess is that little stump, or a tall stump slash, almost tall enough to be called a snag, like it was probably going to decompose and start falling apart and being too soft in a couple of years. So if you have forests that you're responsible for, we want to be thinking about, what are the new trees that are going to be the future trees? And also what are the ages of trees that we're allowing to die over different times in the year to make sure that we're keeping all different ages of deadwood, all different sizes and species and moisture levels of deadwood, because every one supports a different community of invertebrates. Let alone salamanders, let alone everybody else, right? Oh, and here's the shiny green. I have these slides out of order. Here's the shiny green sweat bee going into those little holes, poking out of the little holes, looking like little magical jewels. And then here's a really fantastic diagram from a paper from the 1960s where this guy was making these little chambers inside the wood. And then this researcher actually very carefully excavated some example nests to figure out the shape and size of all those little chambers in those little tunnels throughout the log. All right. And so we're just hanging out still in nesting here. I'm not going to show you the schematic again, but we're going over kind of, we're still in the nesting idea, but we've moved into bumblebees now. And I gave you that story that bumblebees are solitary over the winter, social during the summer, right? And so that means that there's a transition period from solitary to social, right? So imagine you're a bumblebee queen, you're all alone, and you have to find a way to start the whole colony. When do you do that? You do that in spring. If you're one of those bees who's forest associated, you're doing that in the forest in the spring. And so this is another thing that I really like to do. It uses a different sense often than your eyes. This one is often a hearing-based activity first, where you hear, you're like, what the heck is going on? And it's a big bumblebee queen who's come out of hibernation and is starting to both look for flowers to get enough pollen and nectar to fuel her first eggs, and is looking for a place to start her colony. And she'll often have overwintered just a couple feet or meters from where her last year's colony was. But there, if lots of the different queens produced by last year's colony were all successful in surviving the winter, there's a bunch of them all looking for a new place to nest. And so this can look like, and this one, I don't know if you can see, it's a little blurry, but this bumblebee is kind of checking out little dark spots, checking under leaves, saying, is this a place where a mouse nested last year, where I can nest this year? Is this a little protected area between two logs that fell down where I'll have a little protected chamber for my little social nest? Or is this a hollowed out log with a little area where I can have a protected nest? And so she checks out all the little dark spots, and you can watch her doing it. I've sat and watched and I'll be like, oh, she's been down there for like a whole minute. This must be the one. And then like, when she flies away and you're like, I don't know why she rejected it. Something wasn't right. The feng shui was off. And so this figure is just that same idea again. Bumblebee overwintering in the soil or the leaves, comes up, gets as many resources as she can, finds a place to establish a nest, lays all of her eggs, then the worker bees take over. Then we see all the worker bees often in our gardens, right, and in our crops, but the queen and the nest may actually be back in the hedgerow, in the woodlot, in that log pile, somewhere off into the forested area, even if the bees are flying into your yard to pollinate. And then at the end of the season, they make next year's queens, next year's males. They all go find each other and mate. Everybody else dies. The queens overwinter and it starts again the next year. And so this is the last kind of dense thing I'm going to show you here, but the queens, as I'm saying, are really using those early spring resources. And there was a study on our federally listed Bombus affinis, the rusty-patched bumblebee, who you may have heard of. This was really careful work done in Colorado. And what they did was they took every historical record of all of the known flowers used by every life stage of the rusty-patched bumblebee, and they again found, similar to what I've been saying, that the queens were largely using forest understory resources, but the workers and the males later in the season were using grassland and wetland flowers. So like open habitat resources, included gardens, included, crops. But then what they did was they took all of the botanists and the historical records from over a century of museum data, and they found that it was only the forest resources that were declining from like regular botanical surveys going out across this landscape. And so they concluded that one of the major threats to our federally listed Bombus affinis was declines in the quality, resource, and abundance of early spring forest resources, because they had enough resources later in the season. So it was a bottleneck where that pinch point where the queens are coming out of hibernation, if they can't start the colony, it doesn't matter how much food there is in June. If you can't get past April, it doesn't matter how many meadows you plant. If your forest is degraded because of invasive species or excessive deer browse or, any number of other problems, a disease with, we have a lot of problems with beech brush here because they all have beech bark disease and they all clonally resprout and they spread with enormous shade tolerance all over the forest understory and smother out a bunch of other stuff. There's lots of different reasons that are regionally specific why there's different challenges to forest health across the country. And in this case, they were finding that that was a pinch point for our federally endangered Bombus affinis. So in my last minutes here, I'm going to move up to the canopy. Sorry, I got sad again. We're going to get happy again. Um, which is the final thing to send you home with, which is just the magical importance of canopy resources for pollinators. Red maple, other maples, and willow, especially if any of you are beekeepers here, this is a well-known, super abundant resource. One thing that's really cool, tons and tons and tons of bees use all of the different maples. Even box elder sometimes, but mostly sugar and red and silver. But um, but maple willows have over 30 different species of specialized pollinators. So those solitary bees who only use a single species, willow is so abundant and so high quality that over 30 different species have decided to just only use willow. So, if you have an area where willow is appropriate based on soils and moisture, et cetera, super great resource. There's some sumac specialists, there's some ericaceous specialists. I like to highlight the ericaceae, especially the blueberry family, because in fire-driven regions or fire-driven forests where that kind of understory of ericaceae, that they have a whole suite of really, really cool organisms that are dependent on those. And then finally, I do just like to highlight that it is some of our wind pollinated trees. Sugar maple, we don't think of as insect pollinated, but we know that bees use a ton of sugar maple pollen, and the average sugar maple tree has 100 billion grains of pollen. And oak has more than that, and all of our wind pollinated species. So for the ones that do offer enough protein, it's just a stunning amount of pollen. And so that's really cool. So oak is actually used in large amounts by osmia, the mason bees, of course, species like cherry. I'm highlighting also hickory and some other wind pollinated species here as a reminder that, of course, this is not a talk about butterflies, but so many of our native trees are also crucial host plants for so many butterflies. That's just a subject of a whole other talk. And then I bring up Tilia as an example. This is linden as an example of basically anything that has an obviously insect pollinated flower, right? It's showy. It has clear petals. It has a classic like flower look to it, as opposed to the catkins of a wind pollinated species. You can be pretty darn sure that it's operating as a meadow in the sky for your bees. And I like to say each flowering canopy tree is a temporary meadow in the sky. So spread the word. And here's a picture on the right here of oak catkins that were in perfect, or on both sides actually. These are oak flowers that had bees running up and down. All right, and so I'm just gonna wrap up here. Forest-associated bees are lost when we drop below a certain percentage of forest in the landscape. We want to keep forests as forests. We don't want to convert the land, but we do want to think about actively stewarding our forests, evaluating these different features of forest health and diversity and resiliency to drought and pressures, and working with land managers and ecological foresters who are thinking carefully about how to steward our forests for maximum diversity and climate resiliency. And we know that both large and small patches of forest have value, right? If you're in a highly simplified agricultural landscape, even a hedgerow or a small woodlot is making a difference, but we don't want to make any more fragmentation. We want to be trying to add back connections between fragmented pieces. And there's no one-size-fits-all habitat. Bees are just as complicated as every other organism, every other group. And I'm going to skip past that, but happy to talk about it. And so we know there's lots and lots of bees in these openings, but then once we get back to really complex, mature forest, we have all those bees again, using all those features that we just talked about. And you can help support them if you have a whole forested habitat by thinking about your overall forest stewardship plan. And also if you have a smaller area, can think about things like hedgerows, single specimen trees with healthy soft landings beneath them, or transition zones from a wood's edge into a grassy area can be a wonderful place to diversify and maximize niche diversity. We call these soft edges, not going tree to lawn or tree to field, but instead adding a transition zone for all different organisms to use different sizes. And I am going to leave it there because I am at time and I don't want to run past these last things and not get to at least get one or two questions or feedback. So sorry I got chatty at the beginning, but I think we got the gist of it. So thanks for
Uh,
bearing with.
that was great. I think it's good that we're recording that because people can replay it and play it at a slower speed
Yes.
because you can pack a lot of words into a 50-minute talk, Cass. Good job.
We only have a couple of minutes for questions, but there is a question in the chat here from Michelle Morgan, who is asking, how can you argue with neighbors who insist that all dead wood and snags need to be cleared to reduce the risk of fire?
Um, yeah, I don't live in a super fire prone place, so I tend to try to cede to other land stewards who are dealing with a higher risk of wildfire. Just to, you know, that's not a major issue here, but the most,
It's actually not a big issue here either.
yeah, I was also going to be like, I'm going to let you guys speak to that.
Yeah,
Um,
I think you have them watch this video, right? I think that's a good solution. Just sit them down and have them learn things. And one thing that I was going to say, Cass, is that talks like this, I hope show people that research is valuable. We use research in so many ways. We understand our world through research. So if we can all do our part to convince somebody who thinks that research dollars are a waste, that would be a really great thing. Because it really, the more we
Great.
know, the more we understand how much we don't know and we still have yet to know, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I like to ground things generally in helping people think through the history of our forests and our landscapes and thinking about how how they've come to be where they are, and that may include indigenous histories of management, indigenous histories of, or sorry, histories of clearing and regrowth, which is especially a story in New England. Um, Legacies of exploitative harvests are really different than an active forest stewardship or forestry approach that is seeking to restore balance or age class diversity or help bring light to seedlings that can't regenerate without light. And so I think understanding that, the managing forests is a huge range of different approaches and different philosophies, and that it is really, really important to understand that the ways our forests are now are impacted by first indigenous stewardship, then enormous changes abiotically and biotically to the pressures that we're facing. We're facing huge changes for climate change, and pretending that forests need to stay untouched over there is dangerous because they desperately need thoughtful, attentive, active engagement, which is always been true, right? There is no untouched wilderness. There is only a landscape with which we engage as thoughtfully as possible. And pollinators are a huge part of that. And I think can be an avenue to say, I mean, here especially, like, this is a really special place, but actually it was tilled, and that's why we don't have any understory spring ephemerals. And so what does it mean to restore that health, or et cetera? Maybe all of our forests are around here, a lot of them are all 80 years old. What does it mean to actively bring back age class diversity so that we have old trees and we have future trees? And so I think the same kind of conversation is where I was trying to go with fire too, right? Is like, how frequent was historical fire? Is there a role for fire today? Are there plants that we rely on, that maybe special bees rely on, that only come back in the presence of some level of frequent fire or frequent other disturbance? Because that may have been how that forest evolved. And that story is different everywhere, right? That story is different on every slope. That story is different based on moisture. That story is different based on which industries were active, where you live. And so just re-engaging with an active, thoughtful, historically informed stewardship is always going to serve us better than pretending that not touching something and that it's okay anyway is the best way to go. But it requires a lot of humility and a lot of deep study of your local organisms, which is why I like to lead with, here's some stories, what's happening near you and how are they being affected by the pressures near you?
Yes.
So
Thank you.
same with
Cass.
fire.
That was awesome. And I think that also I recently watched a series of research for people that are managing forests in the face of changing environments. It's the U.S. Forest Service put the series on, and the last one was on bats and bat conservation. And it struck me how what we do to help bats is the same as what we can do to help migratory birds, which is the same as what we can do to help the insects in the forest. And that is to put back the diversity that was there, because that where they go to feed and shelter is different from where they need to go with their young. It's different from where they need to go in the winter versus spring. And that diversity is so important. We're just only beginning to understand how all of those things are connected. Thank you, Kass.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you.
We have another question. This is from Lindsay Wells. My friend in Atlanta says her carpenter bees have turf wars and run each other into her windows. Do our local bees ever fight over spots?
Carpenter bees are some of the most charismatic little friends there. One really fun thing about carpenter bees that they're big enough that we can all learn to identify the males versus the females. So I'm going to tell you right now, the males are first of all, the males are all the ones who are doing the like thing outside your house or your barn or taking but they also have a yellow patch on their face. They have a big square that's yellow that you can see. And we didn't talk about this today, but male bees can't sting. A stinger is a modified ovipositor, which is like a fun fact you can tell at parties. And so if you're not a female bee, you can't sting. So those male bees that are having these turf wars that are going around, being all like territorial and defensive, you can grab them straight out of the air. If your dog grabs one, if you're sure it was a male, you don't have to worry that it's getting stung because they can't sting. And so, yeah, they're super territorial. They're silly. And then you also see a lot of that kind of aggressive behavior if you have the non-native Anthidiums. What are they called? The common name. Wool carder bees that visit a lot of mints and Mediterranean herbs that a lot of us grow. And one of the really common species or genera that visits all of our mints is the wool carder bees, which are super cool. They scrape all the little soft trichomes off the underside of soft leaves like a lamb's ear. And then they take that back and make like a little woolly nest for their babies. But they're really, really aggressive, and you'll see them knocking other bees off of especially your herbs and mints. So there's any number of fun stories there. So
Well,
anyway.
I hate to cut us off, but
no, it's yeah.
our hour is over, and thank you so much, Kass. It's been a delight.
Yeah,
It's
we could invite Kass back for like the next 10 years and learn.
I think we could.
Thank you, Kass. All right, our next guest is Michelle Wiedig. And Michelle, are you online? And do you want to start sharing your screen? Kass has taken hers off.
Yep, I am here.